Hi class, today I'm going to finish chapter 10 of Toliver's Secret. When we left off last time, Ellen had met Mr. Murdoch, who put her on the back of his horse, and she convinced him to ride her to Elizabethtown, but he said only after dinner, because his wife, Mrs. Murdoch, would not be happy if he came back really, really late. So he was going to take them home, get something to eat, and then he would ride her there. And when we left off, she was in the house. Ellen was in the house with Mrs. Murdoch, and she was airing out her bread, which had fallen in the water. It got really soggy, so she had put the bread down next to the fire. The woman looked at it. "It's right soggy," she said. "Not good for much." She picked up the wet kerchief and spread it out to dry on a pile of firewood. "Your feet are soggy, too," she said as she bent down to look at Ellen's shoes. "And your breeches." Those are her pants. "Faith, you're wet to the skin," she cried, wiping her hands on her apron. "Take off those breeches, Toliver," she ordered. "We'll hang them by the fire, too." Take off her breeches and risk that woman finding out she was a girl? Ellen was alarmed. How could she explain why she was dressed up as a boy? Yes. Sorry. Take off her breeches and risk that woman finding out she was a girl? Ellen was alarmed. How could she explain why she was dressed as a boy? Only spies and criminals went around pretending to be someone else. "Oh no," she cried in dismay. "I'm going to Elizabethtown tonight." "Elizabeth?" The woman stared at her. "Tonight? In the dark? And in this kind of weather? You'd freeze to death." "But I must go. Mr. Murdoch said he'd ride me there." "Ride you to Elizabeth on a night like this?" The farmer's wife clapped her hands to her head. "What now? That man must have lost his wits." She gripped Ellen's shoulders roughly in her strong hand. "Take off those breeches, boy. You're chilled to the bone. What ails you? Are you bashful?" Ellen drew back. "Someone is waiting for me," she began. Suddenly the woman picked her up, tossed her on the bed, and started to peel off the wet breeches. Ellen kicked her legs and tried to squirm away. At that, the woman's face went white with anger. "There will be no riding out where those soldiers are tonight," she said through her tight lips. "If he gets shot, I've got 4 boys to raise, so you can take off those breeches and let them dry. He's not going to Elizabeth, and neither are you." In desperation, Ellen pushed the woman's hands away, and grabbing the top of her breeches, kicking her feet, she worked her way to the edge of the bed. Mistress Murdoch stepped back and looked at her. "What's wrong with you, Toliver?" she cried. Quickly, Ellen scrambled from the bed and ran for the door. She was glad to find it was not bolted. She flung it open and darted out into the night, pulling up her breeches as she ran. Thank goodness she had not yet taken off her jacket or her shoes. She flew through the gate and across the road and hid among the trees. It was not until the door swung closed and all was dark that she remembered. She ran out of that house so fast. What did she forget? The most important thing. The whole purpose of this whole story. The bread. The loaf of bread. She had left it on the hearth. A wild fright came over her as she stood shivering in the dark, cold night. What could she do now? She couldn't tell Mr. Murdoch. He was suspicious about the bread anyway, and she couldn't go back to the door. That stubborn woman might take away all her clothes and give her a cornmeal sack for a nightdress. She was shaking with cold and fear and anger. How could she ever have forgotten the bread that she had guarded so carefully all day? How could she have been so stupid? Then a square of light broke into the darkness, and there stood Mistress Murdoch in the open doorway. "Here, pig," the woman said as she flung Ellen's loaf to the pig. "Turn that soggy old bread into pork." The door slammed shut, and all was dark again. Ellen could hear the pig grunt and snuffle around. When he found the bread, he would gulp it quickly, and in his greediness, he would swallow the snuff box too. Ellen was afraid of pigs. She always walked clear of those lean, hungry public pigs who wandered about the New York streets and ate all the garbage. She remembered the mean look of the pig who had chased her this morning. But now there wasn't a second to lose. She had to get the bread. She could feel her kneecaps shaking, and she couldn't make them stop as she raced across the road. If only there was more light from the pale stars overhead. She put out her hands to grope for the pig's prickly back, and when she felt it, she ran her fingers down to his lowered head. But the thought of his sharp teeth made her snatch them away. The smell of him, the awful smell of him made her gag. Again she reached out her hands. He rumbled in his throat and gave her a shove with his hips. She ran her hands along his back again, and he snorted angrily. Now her eyes had grown used to the dark, and she could tell that the bread was already in his mouth. She must grab for it. There was nothing else to do. Quickly she snatched her cap from her pocket and swished it across his eyes, back and forth across his eyes. The pig tossed his head and snorted in rage. It was a terrifying sound, but when Ellen saw the bread fall from his mouth, she scooped it up quickly and darted out of his way. She was glad he was tied to the stake and couldn't charge her. Here's a picture and the illustration of Ellen. All right, so do you remember how she said that she was feeling down his back, right, to get to his mouth? Okay, and then there's the bread there. The breeches are these. Okay, so she's wearing like the boys back then used to wear a lot of layers too, just like the girls did, but the boys layered, so he had like kind of socks, I guess you could call them, and they went up pretty high on their leg, and then those were the breeches. Okay. As she raced through the gate and down the road, her feet barely touched the ground. She heard the door open and Mistress Murdoch call out, "You all right, Pa? You got the boys there with you?" But Ellen didn't turn to look. Mistress Murdoch couldn't see her running down the road, for she was out of sight with the loaf of bread in her trembling arms. She knew Grandfather's box was safe inside. She could feel with her fingers that there was only one bite gone, and not a very big bite at that. Since she had no kerchief to wrap around it, she tucked it up under her jacket, where it sat like a lump of ice on her stomach. All right, so that was the end of chapter 10, and we'll continue the rest, only a few more to go.